Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 43rd Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. I am your host, as always, Joseph Pochgai Alvarez, based at the University of Osaka. And I'm extremely happy to have a great group of panelists for today's conversation about the ways that we define and understand corruption and the potential implications of different definitions of corruption for matters of measurement. And I'm joined today here by my faraway colleagues, Professor Elizabeth David-Barrett, Dr. Rebecca Dobson Phillips, Professor Seumas Miller, and Professor Emanuela Ceva. Um, and if you have been, and I can see many familiar faces that have been present for previous roundtables, today's is slightly different because today we're having an honest to God roundtable. So in the past, we have mostly followed a webinar format in which I invited an expert to give a presentation, and then we'll have some questions and a little bit of a conversation around it. Today is slightly different in that it will serve as a proper roundtable, but that doesn't mean that we won't have time for Q&A. So first, we'll have a couple of rounds where I invite the panelists to present a little bit about their work, specifically related to new definitions of corruption, new understanding, and in the case of Professor Miller, what we should understand about institutional corruption and how that connects to other areas of our field. And after a couple of rounds, I will open the floor for any questions or comments that the rest of the participants may have. All right, everything else will remain as usual. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentations. If you would like to, at some point, ask a question after the presentation has been finalized, just click the emoji of the hand or just raise it in front of the camera, and I will invite you to unmute yourself. Of course, you can also ask any questions or make comments in the chat, and if you feel fine with it, then I will ask it or comment it on your behalf. All right. So I don't want to take any more of the time that we have for this conversation. I would like to start then by inviting Professor Elizabeth David-Barrett and Dr. Dobson Phillips to tell us a little bit about their most recent paper. So for those of you who haven't been following this conversation via the academic literature, they and another colleague published very recently the paper Defining Corruption in Context, in which they elaborate on what I call the traditional or the most consensual definition of corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, but with a twist in that they elaborate, they build on it to provide something new. So, Liz, Becky, if you could tell us what is your evaluation about this definition that you borrow from and that you build on, and what exactly are you proposing as an improvement or a variation, or in any other way that you would like to put it. The floor is yours. If you would like to share your screen, please feel free to do so.
Sure, thank you, Joseph. And yeah, it's really lovely to be here. It's so nice to see quite a few familiar faces there in the crowd. So it's really nice to be here. We've prepared a presentation which we've agreed that I will present. But Liz, do you want to say anything in advance, or do you want to leave it
No,
till?
absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And take, here we go. Can you see my screen? Yeah, excellent. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to do as brief an outline as I can manage. I know I've got 10 minutes. I'll do my best. I'm not known for timekeeping, so I'm going to do my very best. I'm going to give you a sort of brief outline of the paper that I published earlier this year in Perspectives on Politics with two colleagues, Elizabeth David-Barrett, who's here today, and Robert Barrington. And we titled the paper Defining Corruption in Context, in recognition that whenever we're defining anything, we're always doing so within a context and with some kind of purpose in mind. The sort of background context to the paper is, as Joseph mentioned earlier, that there is a sort of emerging or emerged or recognised standard definition of corruption that's used widely by academics and practitioners. We can see it being sort of used in research papers across the social sciences. We can see it being used by practitioners in government, in civil society, and indeed the definition is a civil society definition in its origins. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, the definition that's used by Transparency International. But it has lots of challenges, not least that, of course, any definition is always contested, both from outside, but also within the dimensions of that definition. There are contestations, and there's a lack of consensus over the meaning and the scope of the three dimensions that come out of this definition. So the dimension of abuse, that there's some form of abuse that takes place, what we mean by entrusted power. Are we talking about just the kind of entrusted power that's invested in the state? Or are we talking about entrusted power relationships more broadly in the private sector, for example? And then the notion of private gain, often interpreted as a sort of personal or material gain, but then also kind of can include political gains, for example, or partisan gains, as we call them, sort of more broadly. And the implications of this is that when we're talking about corruption, even when we're using ostensibly the same definition, we might well be talking about quite different things. So we might be interpreting those dimensions in different ways. And this was basically the puzzle that we encountered, and we're trying to address in the article. In kind of working through these three dimensions and the ambiguities that they contain, we ended up proposing an alternative definition. So the alternative is derived from and builds upon the so-called standard definition. And we propose corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain that harms the public interest, typically breaching laws, regulations, and/or integrity standards. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit in the next few slides. But essentially, kind of the innovation there is to add the notion of harm to the public interest, and create a four-dimensional definition. Harm is not incorporated into most formal definitions, but it's certainly there implicitly. I mean, it's the reason most of us are sitting around this virtual round table, right? That we actually care about the harms that corruption inflicts on our societies, on our institutions, on our politics. And it's also central to the ways in which the public perceive corruption. They perceive it through and experience it through the harms that it inflicts on them. So in part, we're trying to kind of also draw connections to some of the sort of wider interpretations of corruption that there might be in society more broadly. We believe that we make 5 contributions to the literature, and also to kind of this space and this discourse. We provide sub-definitions to each of the 4 dimensions of our definition, which enables us to discuss and sort of clarify the interpretive scope of each of those dimensions. In doing so, we do kind of position ourselves within that kind of interpretive scope, but we kind of don't necessarily impose that upon others. We're trying to kind of identify kind of what's the range of ways in which each of these dimensions can be understood and can be interpreted, so that people working in different spheres and with different interests and needs, research needs, practical needs, can at least understand where they sit in relation to others in their kind of interpretations of those dimensions. And it allows us to explore kind of marginal cases and examples where corruption might be, or the label of corruption put on a particular case or a particular example might be highly contested, and how we might work out or work through those contestations and those sort of disagreements. We suggest that some of this kind of ambiguity around the concept of corruption and sort of identifying corruption in context can be resolved, or at least assisted, by applying each of the dimensions in sequence. So beginning with identifying the entrusted power relationship and seeing that as the context in which corruption occurs. And of course, that entrusted power relationship might be, like I said before, the relationship between the state and society, for example, but it might also be the relationship between a lawyer and their client, or it could be the relationship between a private sector company and the public, kind of the public institution that might have contracted them to do some public related work, for example. Once you can establish the entrusted power relationship, then you move on to identifying an abuse. Again, highly contested space. That abuse might be illegal activity, criminal activity, or it might be kind of more sort of normalized practices within an institution, for example. Again, kind of identifying that abuse is each dimension is tricky. Then you move on to private gain, and then finally to identifying harm to the public interest. And what we argue and try to illustrate in the article is how doing it in this order helps you to resolve some of the ambiguities that you might find in each of the stages, basically. We specifically focus on specifying the scope of the abuse. In the literature, there is kind of quite a lot of discussion about this being kind of the trickiest dimension or the most contested dimension. I think in writing the article, I would push back on that a little bit. I think all of the dimensions are actually highly contested, but it seems to be the one that kind of people have argued over most in academia, at least. What is the standard by which we determine an abuse? An abuse has taken place. The challenge of kind of whether we use the law, so we have a legal standard, or whether we use sort of public opinion. Is it just public opinion that decides whether an abuse has taken place, or whether we look at kind of the outcomes, the injustices, the public interest question? And we argue that for the abuse dimension, we can clarify this by adding, which we do to the definition, this notion that typically an abuse is a breach of laws, regulations, or integrity standards that then leads to a failure to fulfill a role or a duty. And so we're kind of, I guess we're sort of sitting a little bit on the fence here, I suppose, a little bit. So we're acknowledging that it's not wholly subjective what is an abuse, but also that abuses can vary depending on context. So depending on institution, depending on political context in which you're working. The fourth contribution is that we incorporate some forms of institutional corruption. So we've kind of engaged with the institutional corruption literature, which I know Seumas Miller is going to be talking about in more depth, so I won't go into that in too much detail. But we've taken some of the insights from that literature on board in terms of interpreting or conceptualizing through our definition. The one thing we don't take on, because we retain the notion that there is some kind of abuse at the center of our definition, is that we don't take on this notion that an institution can be corrupted without there being kind of corrupt agents within the institutions. There's some kind of abuse that takes place. But we have taken on the notion that institutions themselves hold entrusted power, not just individuals, that abuses can include institutional practices, and those practices can be very kind of ingrained practices, and that private gain can also include institutional gains, including gains to public institutions, right? So as well as harms to them. So we've taken on those notions. And then finally, we incorporate the question, or we incorporate harm to the public interest, and we go to some lengths to defend this addition, while acknowledging that it adds complexity, and it's challenging to kind of incorporate this notion into the definition. But we think that despite there being sort of challenges, it's beneficial, and it actually overall helps us to understand the notion of corruption better. It helps us to identify corruption where the nature of the entrusted power is ambiguous. So, for example, where an institution may have multiple entrusted power relationships with other private sector organizations or with their boards potentially, but also with a public interest. With an entrusted power relationship to a public institution, for example. So it helps us to kind of resolve some of those questions, where individual might have held a position of power, have an entrusted power role, and then moved out of that position. So to the extent to which that entrusted power, the responsibilities that were related to that entrusted power follow them beyond their kind of formal entrustment with that power, because they still they carry with them some of that power after they've left their formal position. It can help us to resolve kind of or to explore kind of questions of activities that might appear to be corrupt in the sense that they abuse entrusted power for private gain, but they in fact end up promoting a public good, and kind of help us to sort of resolve and think through some of those questions. What might otherwise be called kind of noble cause corruption. It's one of the ways that you might think about that. And then where the private gain is negligible, but the harm is significant. And I think we often kind of look at the significance of corruption through kind of, what's the material gain? What's the material sort of benefit that these corrupt individuals have taken? And that's not necessarily commensurate to the harm that the corruption that they've engaged in wields. So sort of this sort of refocus on harm. And finally, and this is my final slide, I see I'm a bit over 10 minutes, just to remind you of the definition that we propose. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain that harms the public interest, typically breaching laws, regulations, and/or integrity standards. And the corruption pyramid here is basically a very simple illustration of our overall argument, which is that each of the dimensions that you can see, entrusted power, abuse, private gain, and public interest, need to be kind of understood so need to be applied in sequence. So starting from the foundations of the pyramid at the bottom there, entrusted power, and that there are a range of ways in which each of these can be interpreted. You can interpret entrusted power simply as a public office role, or you can think about trusted roles in the private sector, for example. You can think about abuse as being an illegal activity, a legal standard used in order to identify or justify that kind of label of abuse, or we can think about legal activities. And indeed, if we think about legal corruption and the ways in which the law might not necessarily be a sort of reliable judge of corrupt activity in places where it's been manipulated and influenced by certain interest groups. Private gain, again, we often think about it as personal gain, material gain, but actually there might well be partisan gains to groups rather than individuals, gains to political parties, and those gains may not be material, they may be status gains, they may be all kinds of different non-material gains that are accrued by those groups. And then finally, the public interest. So thinking about kind of direct harms that we might see from corrupt activity, cost to the public purse, for example. But then on the other side, the indirect harms, the harms to democratic institutions, the undermining of the rule of law, for example. And I think if you read up kind of the left-hand side of the pyramid, you have sort of the more conventional view of what we mean by corruption. And then kind of as you move towards kind of the right-hand side of the pyramid, you see kind of a much more sort of expanded view of the interpretation of each of the dimensions. That's it.
Thank you so much, Becky. Many interesting points. I'm particularly fascinated by how it connects to previous conversation that we have held in this series. Some of them covered in other presentations. Many of the points that you have made really new, or at least for this series. Something that really sticks to me is what you mentioned about how the dimension of abuse is quite difficult to figure that one out. In light of your discussion, the title makes a lot of sense, right? Definition in context, because indeed, what is an abuse seems to be very contextual, right? And the example that usually come to my mind when I think about this is the practice of lobbying, for example, how it varies from country to country, and what is the perception of the public about that, and even such thing as political appointments, which are common everywhere in the world. But the degree to which, or the scope of political appointments and how common they are across different levels of the state, that's really specific, right? And so indeed, we may consider then that a proper understanding of corruption then is more local rather than global or even regional, right? Another point that I really was taken by is this line that you made about how the private gain may be small, but the harm is quite substantial. Eh, because that invites also conversation that we have had in the past, but it's very is in its infancy, I will say, which is related to costing corruption, right? So of course the question about how much money is lost in waste and corruption every year there has been a number going around for a number of years, even though we don't actually have data, and this is even just normally connected to bribery, to the amounts being transacted. But if we were to start estimating the actual harm done to institutions, that's a completely different story, right? Very
Absolutely,
complex
yeah.
at the same time, and potentially even impossible to put a dollar sign on that answer.
Yeah.
Professor Miller, if I may now invite you to join the conversation. So you of course wrote a few years back a fascinating book about institutional corruption, a concept that had been elaborated in the past by Thompson and Lessig, of course, very much in the American context. But in your book, you develop a quite comprehensive theoretical framework, I would say, to understand institutional corruption that potentially is applicable without looking at one specific jurisdiction, at least the way that I see it. At the same time, institutional corruption seems to be somewhat apart to this more common definition of corruption that is based on the abuse of entrusted power for private gain that is common by the World Bank and Transparency International. So could you tell us about how you understand institutional corruption, what it entails, and how do you see that fitting within the more general field of corruption studies?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to see if I can share this. Uh, if I can find it to share. Uh, Here it is. Is that coming up?
Yes, we can see it. If you can just make it full screen.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, Gotta get rid of this. Is that better?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Can I make it go forward and backwards?
Yes, it's moving.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, so as Joseph was saying, that's a set of books and articles I've been working on. I think you were referencing the institutional corruption book back in 2017.
That's right.
Um, if anyone's interested, let's see. Okay, so this is in two parts, in compliance with Joseph's requirements, I guess. First section's on the sort of theory, and the second is on the measurement. So the story I give about institutional corruption is basically we need to understand what institutions are. There can be many things that are corrupt, from coins to personalities to this and so on. But if we're talking about corruption, we need to know what it is that we're talking about. Institutional corruption refers to institutions, and we need, therefore, some account of what institutions are. Some people think that, conventions are institutions and so on. But basically, we need to relativize it to some conception of institution. And the conception that I operate with is organizations or systems of organizations, governments, bureaucracies, criminal justice, but also market-based institutions, public and private sector. and there's a whole book that I've written on what institutions are and so on, but I won't go into all that. But the critical points are that they're organizations or structures of organizations, but also that they have purposes, normatively speaking. Of course, some of them aren't realizing and don't even pursue those purposes to the extent that they should. But and those purposes, I use the term, are essentially collective goods of various kinds. But it's important to realize that particular institutions have particular collective goods. So they don't just serve the public good in some generic sense. They're there to serve narrow particular purposes. So in the case of police, it's securities. In the case of universities, let's say knowledge, and so on. So they have narrow purposes, which are the collective good of those institutions. And importantly, the collective goods in question in terms of institutions are at the minimum morally acceptable, and in most cases, in fact, morally desirable. That's important because it ends up ruling out certain sorts of organizations on this view. For example, the mafia can't suffer institutional corruption because their basic purpose and ways of proceeding are not morally acceptable. So they can certainly be undermined. They can suffer moral wrongdoing and so on. But what they can't do is suffer institutional corruption on this view. So the view is, first point is that institutional corruption is in the relevant sense is a moral concept. Secondly, that this is a causal theory. So there are a whole bunch of different actions that are count as acts of corruption. I mean, bribery, nepotism, the list is endless. And so it's almost impossible to find something in common. But you need something in common to be talking about institutional corruption. And the suggestion that I made many years ago and have been defending is that we need to understand institutional corruption as a causal concept. And acts of institutional corruption are acts that have certain sorts of, or have a tendency to have certain sorts of effects. Namely, they undermine institutional processes, purposes, or the virtues of role occupants, qua role occupants. And that's the basic causal story. Importantly, that means that, contrary, say, someone like Lessig, that means that the institutional role occupants have to be, the acts of corruption have to be formed by institutional role occupants. So the notion that somehow corruption is going on independent of individual human role occupants is ruled out from the start on my account, which is not to say that there aren't all sorts of causal processes that undermine institutions that are not due to individual human actors, but they come under the heading of institutional corrosion on my account. It's also the case that corrupt actions typically often breach laws, regulations, institutional processes and duties, but this is not necessarily the case. There are many breaches of rules and laws and so on that aren't instances of corruption. A bank robber is not necessarily a corrupter. And there are many possibilities of corrupt actions that aren't actually necessarily breaches of laws, regulations, or even institutional duties. And one thinks of bribery prior to the Foreign Practices Act and so on and so forth. I've already suggested there's a distinction between corruption and corrosion. That article that came out last year, I've tried to elaborate that in greater detail. But roughly speaking, any organization which may or may not have a collective good can be undermined in various ways, the mafia, and it can suffer, therefore, corrosion. Secondly, as I've already suggested, corrosion is something that can take place independent of any one human actor being responsible for some particular action. It could take place because of under-resourcing, which is no one's fault, no one's moral responsible, but nevertheless, over time, the institution is corroded. So there's a critical distinction, therefore, between institutional corruption and institutional corrosion. So the definition that I offered all those years ago and have been flogging ever since, whether or not to any great effect, is the following one. So an act X, whether a single or joint action performed by an institutional actor, a single actor or a combination of actors. And it's important to see here that the business of institutional corruption is often cooperative action, and indeed the business of combating corruption is often necessarily cooperative or joint action, and hence there's a lot of room for the concept of collective responsibility in relation to corruption, both with respect to the corruptors and with respect to those who are fighting corruption. And I think that's a moral concept that hasn't been given the weight that it deserves in this in the literature. At any rate, it's an act of institutional corruption. It's an action of a kind that has a tendency to have the effect of undermining or contributing to the undermining of an institutional process or purpose. So that's why bribery counts as corruption. Bribery counts is typically regarded as corrupt because it's an action of a kind that has a tendency to have the effect of undermining, contributing to the undermining of an institutional process or purpose, or to the despoiling of the moral character of some role occupant, qua role occupant. So that's why it's a causal theory, but it's also a morally based theory. Okay, there's a lot of other sort of particular points that I could make that are in the work and so on, but about the difference between a single act of single acts could be acts of corruption, even if they weren't part of a pattern and so on and so forth. I'm going to skip most of that and just focus on a couple of, given the time, on a couple of more general points. So in an act of corruption, is the individual engaged in corruption is a role occupant, and they use the opportunity, they're acting qua role occupant. So if you're a member of an organization, you steal something, but you're not actually using your position to steal it, that doesn't count as corruption, even if it counts as theft and it's unlawful and so on and so forth. Rather, you use the opportunities you act as a role occupant, qua role, and typically you use the opportunities afforded by your role to engage in the act in question. A second point, I'm going to skip some of this because it's the time constraints. A second point, sorry, I'll skip that as well, which I think needs to be sort of stressed here is that, and this comes back to what I said earlier, the condition of corruption only exists relative to some sort of uncorrupted condition. So if an organization, if an act that undermines the purposes and so on and so forth, essentially that it doesn't follow from that the organization or the institution must have been in some pristine form at some point. It could be corrupted from day one because the act of corruption is an act of corruption relative to an uncorrupted condition, which is the condition that the institution ought reasonably to have. It may not ever have had it. Okay, I think that's an important point to keep in mind. Another critical point is this. It pertains to institutional role occupants. What counts as an institutional role occupant? I think there's a tendency to think that, now that I've suggested that institutional role occupants have to be involved for it to be a case of corruption. They don't need to be the only people involved, but they have to be involved in some way for it to be corruption. But then this raises the question as to who counts as an institutional role occupant. Now, there's a tendency to think that it's only people who occupy particular offices or clear examples of institutional role, you know, the the officials, the politicians, maybe the managers and so on in a firm and so on. That's too narrow. So if you just think about this, university students can engage in corruption by, say, plagiarism. They are institutional role occupants for this purpose. They're bound up in the institution. They have certain obligations to and so on and so forth. Also, again, and this is critical, I think, in the context of the history of corruption. You'll notice that people like Plato and these people talked often about the corruption of the citizenry. You think, well, how could the ordinary citizens be engaged in corruption? Well, because vis-a-vis government, they have a role. They have a say in a democracy. They have the role to, um, vote and do and engage in the political process in various ways, and they can be corrupt. So, for example, if you, as a favorite kind of practice is for people to vote for someone because they've been paid, the candidate pays them to vote for. Now, this is a clear case of corruption on the part of the voter, of the citizenry. So, the point I'm making here is that what counts as a role occupant is a tricky notion, but it's not simply the people who are office holders in the narrow sense. Okay, so that essentially brings me to the end. The second part of this is the measurement issue, but I think that's probably
Yes.
enough
Yes, we
for
will
me.
reserve these next slides for the next round of the discussion. Uh, Thank you. There's so much information and insights to unpack. I've made a whole list of notes here in my notebook. I would just refer to a couple of them because I think that they connect very nicely both to the discussion that we're holding today, but more broadly about what we deal with in terms of definition and measurement of corruption more generally. So because you start by making it clear that this builds from a moral perspective. And of course, this is something that has been mentioned in the past a couple of times about how a lot of the knowledge that has been built within our field over the last few decades takes a very individual, liberal perspective, right? So is the public official who is corrupt. This is a decision-making process that, of course, can be influenced by the context, but at the same time, we're talking about the criminalization of behavior, and it needs to be tied to a specific individual. So by referring to a moral perspective, then it brings back a more an older or more historically prior stage or way of looking at corruption that connects it very nicely with previous approaches and paradigms and traditions before these 1970s successful again rise of a liberal tradition. Another thing that really stuck with me is the conversation about role occupants, because it very much reflects and embraces a lot of the discussion that I found in Becky's and Liz's paper about entrusted power, and even your example, right, about what it means to be a role occupant and the type of criminal behavior that one could engage in without it being labeled as corrupt because one is not using the institutional access provided as connected to the job. And indeed, I feel that this is a very important distinction to be made, and that clarifies what it means to act corruptly vis-a-vis the institution. Another thing that I really found interesting was this idea of or the example of paid voters, right? Because indeed they are in these cases of vote buying are participants of a crime, but 99% of the time that we talk about this type of electoral corruption, the role of the citizen is not really addressed, but rather we only focus on the role of the politicians and the system itself, right? Uh, so I found it quite useful to be able to expand and really flesh out the meaning of role occupant so that we can cover indeed all these different individuals that have a role in sustaining the health of the institution, in whichever way we may define it, and so that the level of corruption could be applicable to them. And it makes me wonder how that open up kind of like the area of inquiry moving forward. So I really appreciate this. So now I would like to invite Professor Ceva to for the next part of the presentation. So let me just see here. Professor Miller, if you could stop sharing your screen now.
Uh,
So I was also very interested on about hearing from Professor Ceva. I listened to one of her presentations very recently when she explained the perspective of corruption based on a deficit of accountability in public office. And I'm paraphrasing here, and I apologize for that. Um, but whereas at the very beginning, my gut reaction to that way of understanding corruption was, well, I wonder what it meant for older definitions. At the beginning, I was perhaps even defensive because I very much used the definition provided by Transparency International. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense to me. Of course, that definition and that way of looking at corruption is based on a book that Professor Ceva and her colleague published a couple of years ago called Political Corruption. So Professor Ceva, if you could tell us what prompted you to think about corruption in these terms, because again, it departs somewhat not just from the common definition of corruption, but even from other aspects of the conceptualization of corruption that we have used until this point. And what exactly do you mean then by this deficit of office accountability?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph, and thanks everyone for engaging in conversation today. I'm just share my screen. I hope you can see it. So, in fact, I mean, I'm hoping to persuade you that the account of corruption as a deficit of office accountability that Maria Paola Ferretti and I have developed in our research is in fact not that alien with respect to current accounts and definitions, but actually is capable of pinpointing one common ground, a sort of common thread that goes through various accounts and definitions that allows us to go at the heart of a defining constitutive feature of what corruption is across its many manifestations in a way that invites and mobilizes the members of institutions to take on responsibility for the corruption of their own institution as a matter of public ethics of office. So that's the project. So when Maria Paola and I started to think about corruption, and it was a while back, there were mainly two strands of research that were not very much talking to each other. One, if you wish, more traditional approach to corruption, focalizing on individual corrupt conduct. And that would be the kind of corruption enshrined in the traditional TI definition of corruption as abuse of entrusted public power for private gain, where corruption was a matter of conceived as a matter of individual conduct in breach of some kind of more or less formal regulation. Most of the times motivated by a corrupt or malicious intent. So that there was a fairly strong philosophical tradition deriving from the presence of corrupt behavior, implications in terms of the valuation of the corrupt character of the individuals engaging in corruption. If you wish, this is the traditional bad apple account of corruption. For there to be corruption, there must be someone acting viciously. and this someone is the problem. And that sort of grounded approaches to anti-corruption that were mainly addressed to identify the bad apples, picking them out and removing them, punishing them, replacing them in order to restore non-corrupt institutional mechanisms and forms of interactions. On the other hand, there was this growing trend of reflecting on institutional corruption, mainly as a matter of the corruption of institutional mechanisms. And that's the glaring example in the literature there was private financing of electoral campaigns. In certain countries, especially the United States, we have corruption, not because there is anyone acting out of a corrupt motive, but because people act on the basis of mechanisms that are themselves corrupt. So, Joseph, you mentioned earlier on the case of the presence of lobbies within a democratic system. That would be an illustration of this type of corruption. The politician that refers to lobbyists is not moved by a malicious intent. I mean, in fact, it's part of their job to engage with lobbyists to a certain extent. Nevertheless, because both lobbies and politicians and the very presence of lobbyists represent a corrupt mechanisms, then the institution can be considered corrupt. Even if no one acts on a corrupt motive. So our intent was to ask ourselves the question whether the bad apple or the bad basket account of corruption were actually two elaboration on a conceptual core of corruption that could find conceptually what corruption is about at its very core and essence in ways that then allows further elaborations and specifications. That's also the idea of having definitions of corruption, as we heard in the first presentation, that are sensitive to context, both individual and institutional, and in terms of organizational culture. So that's where we proposed this idea of corruption as a deficit of office accountability. I should perhaps, before telling you how we see this common root of corruption, telling something to clarify how we use political corruption in this context. So when we refer to political corruption, we do not necessarily limit our analysis to the kind of corruption that occurs in politics. So bribery received by politicians, or arguably the presence of lobbies on some institutionalist account. But political here signals etymologically the corruption of the polis. This means that the kind of corruption we discuss in the book is the corruption that we see occurring in public institutions. Then, of course, and this is a conversation I'm very interested in having, the challenge is to see how this account of corruption, or in fact any account of corruption, can also extend to understand corruption in private context, because of course also private organizations like business corporations can instantiate corrupt mechanisms. And the question is whether the mechanisms of use of power in private organizations are similar enough to those characterizing the use of power in public organizations, so that we can extend and operationalize the same definition across private and public context. That's a question that I'm, for instance, currently exploring in a project called the Margins of Corruption, of which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, that looks exactly at the possibility of this expansion. But for the purposes of my presentation in this 4 minutes that I've left, just think about corrupt mechanisms in public institutions, where by public institutions, very much in line with the tradition of institutional theorists, we understand an organization of embodied roles. So institutions are made of roles occupied by human persons, and institutions can become corrupt when two main conditions obtain. When there is an individual or a group of individuals acting in their institutional capacity, that's what we call the office condition, for the pursuit of an agenda whose rationale cannot be vindicated by reference to the terms of their mandate. That's what we call the mandate condition. Let me just tell you briefly about these two conditions. So the first condition is meant to identify the idea that that there are many forms of institutional dysfunction that can be due to a criminal intent or to laziness or inefficiency, but we have corruption only when people act by exercising the power that comes with their role. And the role, as we heard in the earlier presentation, are all the relevant roles formalizing the institutions. So if our public institution is schools, then formal roles will be that of teachers, students, janitors, secretaries, all office holders working together to make institutional action function because of the interrelatedness of the institutional role, so that when one of them use their power of office in ways that are not consistent with the terms of their mandate, all sorts of mechanisms can initiate the deviate institutional action, making corrupt. How? By making office holders incapable of justifying their conduct with reference to their mandate. So we have corruption anytime someone who occupies an institutional role in this broad sense use the power that comes with the role for pursuing an agenda that is not contemplated by their mandate. Of course, institutional mandates can be object of disagreement, and that's why it's so difficult to pinpoint what corruption is. And that has very interesting implication in terms of measurement issues. How can we measure something that is laden with so much uncertainty? Why this uncertainty is there? Because there is a degree of discretion that anyone occupying an institutional role has when they exercise their power of office. And that's why it is so important that, because this discretion is embedded in institutional mandates, office holders are always in the position of accounting for their action, that is, explain why they acted in that way, explain their agenda in a way that is coherent with their best understanding of their power mandate. So because power mandates are described in this way, accountability practices are necessary in order for office holders to be actively engaged and ask themselves the question of what they're doing with institutional power and whether this is supportive of institutional action or not. This definition of corruption actually cuts across various instances of corruption, ranging from bribery to nepotism, clientelism, other forms of favoritism, embezzlement, all those issues that have both private gain and not obvious private gain, but ultimately that embed these forms of unaccountable use of power. What are the main implications of this view? So conceptually, against the traditional institutional theories of corruption, this view invites not to reduce corruption to a matter of institutional mechanisms, but to understand that institutions are not only made of rules, but they're made of people occupying roles. And therefore, in order to identify corruption and counteract corruption, we need to mobilize those occupying institutional roles and hold them accountable for what they do with their power of office. The normative implications of this view is that against the purely consequentialist theories of corruption that mainly understand corruption in terms of its consequences and effects, here corruption has always an inherently problematic dimension, insofar as any member of the organization has a moral duty of accountability, that is, of acting in a way that they can vindicate by reference to the terms of their mandate. When they act corruptly, they always act in a breach of a moral duty. Then there might be justifying or justifications or excuses for them doing so. These are cases of noble cause corruption, dirty hands, for example. But ultimately, there is always a moral remainder, as it were, that makes corruption morally problematic as a matter of ethics of office. And practically, this view has implications for anti-corruption. If we understand corruption as at its roots as a deficit of office accountability, this means that anti-corruption is mainly a matter for a public ethics of office that should guide office holders to sustain the functioning of their institution. This means that there is so much we can attain in terms of anti-corruption through legal means, through punishment, other forms of sanctions, demotion, and you name it. But there's an important sense in which anti-corruption requires the active engagement of office holders and a rethinking of such anti-corruption instruments as ethical training for office holders, codes of conduct. I would like to end on this very concrete example. In the ethics of office and institutional integrity, there is quite a lot of criticism with respect to the current way in which codes of ethics in institutions work, because they're mainly seen as yet another collection of rules that to which office holders are answerable, and that sometimes only performs a very performative function. There's a code of ethics there, no one look at it, but the fact that it's there bureaucratically allows us to tick the anti-corruption box successfully. That's of course not the kind of code of ethics that an ethics of anti-corruption grounded in accountability would sustain, but this approach would invite rethinking ethics codes in a way that can really be, to begin with, not imposed top-down, but created bottom-up by the active engagement of all members of the organization in conversation, perhaps with relevant stakeholders, so that they can really be seen as an identity card, a real ethical charter of the grounding values of what we call in our work the raison d'être of the institution, and the self-understanding of the institution and its grounding values and normative commitments, with respect to which office holders, understood in the broad sense I referred to earlier on, can hold one another accountable so that they can self-assess critically their conduct and engage in practices that can initiate internal mechanisms of correction to corrupt uses of power of office. So that's the view. And my main take-home message on which I would like to end this round is that understanding corruption as in terms of public ethics invites the active engagement of the members of the organization in anti-corruption and also in detection of corruption, which has interesting implication that I would like to point out perhaps in the second round in terms of also in our approach to measuring corruption, or in fact detecting it within institutional mechanisms.
Thank you, Professor Ceva. This is quite fascinating. I like to normally think of the information that I acquire as spheres of knowledge and trying to connect them tightly in a network. Right now, my brain feels a lot more like a Jackson Pollock painting. So like splashes of painting against a white wall and just me trying to make sense of it. I find it fascinating for a number of reasons, not least of all because hopefully the rest of people and colleagues attending this presentation would hopefully already be recognizing that there are significant connections and overlaps between the three presentations. And at the same time, there's a significant separation also between these three approaches and the more conventional, liberal, individualistic approach that has dominated the field of anti-corruption since the 1970s, 1980s. So at the same time, it's very exciting, but of course it makes me nervous as well. And I will say something about that in a few minutes when I introduce the issue of measurement. That of course is another level of complexity. But Professor Ceva, a couple of things that I found extraordinarily insightful are first of all these at least what I see as a connection with a Republican tradition of thinking about corruption in the American context. Yes, specifically about when you mention about political corruption as a corruption of the police, right? So again, thinking about the responsibility of office holders towards the execution of civic duty and their civic responsibility to a much more to a degree that is a lot more moral or reflective of virtue ethics, if that makes sense, compared to the more common over the last few decades that sees corruption in a more economic perspective about the rent-seeking behavior, the fulfillment of private interest, which of course is part of it, but it's not all of it, as I at least understood from your presentation. Another thing that I found very interesting, and here, of course, I try to make connections between these different approaches, even though they don't match exactly, but there's some overlap between them, right? So you mentioned two conditions, the first one being the office condition. And I think that for me, that was the more easily connecting to, oh, well, also the role occupant, the Professor Miller talked about, and the abuse of entrusted power, or the concept, the element of entrusted power that Becky described, right? And then when you introduce the mandate condition, which I find extremely interesting, I immediately thought, well, it's quite interesting that that's also the fourth element, or is related to the fourth element that Becky and Liz are proposing in their definition, right? The idea of being able to identify this harm to the public interest. Uh, Now, of course, there's also differences in what we understand as a harm. In Professor Miller's perspective, the tendency to produce that harm is also already incorporated in the definition of institutional corruption. Um, in the way that you describe it, I got the sense that also, and I think you referred to it at the beginning, right? That corruption of an institution can take place even if no one is acting with corrupt intent. So a lot of nuance here in terms of what we see as or how we label things as being corrupt. And again, the reason why I mentioned the Republican tradition is because, again, for a really long time, if we look at writings about corruption from the 1700s, 1800s in the US and in UK as well, a distinction between the usage of the terms corrupt, corruptly, right? Corruptible, corruption. So not all of them falling within the same category exactly. All of them related, but not being exactly the same. And I found that really interesting. Um, okay, so now I would like to go back to the beginning in terms of the presentations and enter the second round of the conversation, which is, well, what do we do with these new ways of understanding corruption for purposes of data collection and measurement of the phenomenon? And I must admit, I'm not particularly optimistic in terms. I'm sure that a new methodology is not gonna come out of this conversation, and nor should it. Yet at the same time, even if it's to further problematize the discussion about measurement, I am quite curious about what these definitions may mean, because if we were to move towards a different paradigm, almost immediately policymakers and other decision makers will think, well, okay, so how do I start working towards reducing these types of corruption? And how do I monitor that progress? Yes? So I would like to invite now Professor David-Barrett. It's also quite extraordinary. Very recently, of course, she was the head of the program on measuring corruption at IACA. I believe it was during 2023. Uh, uh, and so, of course, she has first-hand experience on the work towards developing new ideas about how we measure this phenomenon that we call corruption. And so I'm very curious to hear from you, Professor David-Barrett. What do you think means this revision of the definition of corruption and the inclusion of this new dimension of public interest for our chances of measuring corruption? Does it facilitate this effort? Does it complicate the effort? So I would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, thanks very much, Joseph, and thanks everyone. Really interesting set of presentations. So just a few reflections on how definitions link to measurement. So when working specifically on measurement, I would often say it's important to have a clear definition and to for everyone to be, there to be consensus on what that definition is. And if you don't have that underlying consensus, then when you're trying to measure across context, you don't really know if you're measuring the same thing. However, I think my overall conclusion sort of reflecting on this over time is that, in fact, although at an abstract level, that's true, when it actually comes to the practicality of measuring, I'm not sure that this work that we've done on the definition translates into being better able to measure. And that's really because I think actually what you're doing in definition is a different kind of animal. So when you think about measurement, the question you're trying to answer is how much of something is there? And when you think about definition, the question you're trying to answer is much more, is this something? And so I think definition is useful for looking at individual cases. So you've got a kind of a practice, a behavior, maybe a scandal, and you want to understand, is this corruption or not? Or you're a government official who is trying to decide whether your mandate covers something or not, and whether something should be included in an anti-corruption policy. I think the definitional work is really important for that kind of a question, but it doesn't necessarily help us with answering the question about how much of something there is. It can also be useful, I think, as well as for identifying individual cases, it can be useful for thinking about new forms of corruption or new practices that perhaps we haven't necessarily called corrupt before, or they just haven't emerged before because they're maybe dealing with new technology or they're responding to a new norm. Again, I think the definition can be very helpful in deciding whether those behaviors are in scope or not. But ultimately, I think it's not so good on the question of how much of something there is. And just to maybe sort of come back to a couple of the points that you raised at the end of Becky's presentation, again, I would extend that to say that not all lobbying, not all political appointments are corrupt. But what is useful is if you've got a particular instance, then you can use, I think, our definitions paper to go and say, is this particular instance an instance of corrupt lobbying or a corrupt political appointment? On your point about the public interest, I think in the discussions we were having in developing the paper, it became very clear to us that this point about harms is really critical to the definition of corruption. It's why we all care about it. And it also explained why sometimes we didn't seem to care about things that were corrupt, or in fact we not only didn't think they were problematic, but might have thought that they were an example of moral behavior. So I think the public interest point we thought was key. But again, it's something that's quite difficult to measure, because what you would really want to be measuring there is the harm or the impact compared to a counterfactual. So if this corruption had not happened, where would we be now? And that's kind of what you're trying to measure there as the gap or the harm. So it's sort of compared to reasonable expectations about how things would have turned out if we'd been operating according to non-corrupt standards or systems. So in statistics, they have this idea about using this synthetics, yeah? So there's a kind of pseudo-controlled group that you're comparing to. And I think, that's what we would want to be doing in terms of measuring the costs of corruption and the harm. It's obviously extremely difficult to do in this kind of context. And that just brings me to my sort of third and final point on this. And one of the reflections from that work at IACA in the Global Programme on Measuring Corruption was that actually context is really quite key. It's definitely key for definition, which is what we're arguing in this paper. But also, in terms of making measurement really useful, I think it does need, or it's most useful when it's measured in context. So, and that's why actually the practice that we often have of comparing countries and ranking countries is not particularly useful for anyone. It sort of doesn't really tell you anything other than very sort of broad patterns. What is much more useful for practitioners is the understanding whether there is more or less corruption in their own context, how that's changing over time, and how that's changing in response to their interventions. I'll stop there, very aware that we're short of time, and lots of
Thank
people.
you. If I may embrace naive optimism for a minute here, I found it very interesting. I really like the point that you made, and to a degree, I do agree that, of course, the definition is a very different animal to measurement, right? Even though, as you mentioned, in order to measure something, we need to at least agree on what that thing is. Uh, but I was just smiling to myself because then you mentioned so many interesting points that about what we can do with a definition in terms of identifying different types of behavior and working with counterfactual. Then I thought, oh wow, there's actually a lot that can be built on upon this definition if we were to look about how we go about measuring it. So I found that very interesting. Professor Miller, back to you. So the institutional corruption theory that you presented in the first round is a very broad framework and of course very carefully constructed, which I really appreciate. Uh, I'm not asking you to be optimistic, but do you feel it can be measured in the same way that we measure frequency of bribery, for example? Not to that degree, but I do wonder how we would go about measuring institutional corruption.
Well, in the spirit of optimism, I'll try try and help you. Um, Again, I'm going to I can't where's the share? Here it is. Uh, I screwed this up again. Uh, how about that? Does that come through?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So we're talking about quantifying corruption and therefore the extent of corruption. So on the view that I hold, I mean, what you do is you've got a bunch of institutions, you try to figure out what practices undermine those are legitimate institutions, they produce collective goods, et cetera, and basically there are a bunch of practices that tend to have a tendency to undermine the purpose of those institutions and the processes constitutive of those institutions and so on and so forth. At a very general level, the extent of corruption depends on at least three things. There's a bunch of gains that people tend to be preoccupied with, wealth, power, status. There's a bunch of institutional conditions and other conditions, of course, that are conducive to corruptions, and then there's various preventative measures that you can put in place, investigations, et cetera. So if you look at those three, there's other things you can look at, but if you look at those three things, you can get, let's call them defeasible general indicators of the extent of corruption. So if a lot of those conditions obtain, if there's an enormous amount of money to be made and there's no accountability mechanisms in place, and these people are very poor, you can probably assume there's going to be a reasonable amount of corruption. Now that's not measuring corruption in a general. It's as it were the first step of looking at where there might be some corruption if you otherwise don't have good indicators. So then you've got measurable indices of the extent of corruption, and the critical thing here are things that already identified actions that are highly that undermine institutions, and we've got a lot of knowledge of these: bribery, nepotism, abuse, and so on and so forth. And indeed, in many instances, we've introduced laws against them. So the first point to be made is clearly that you can count in relation to those already identified practices which are instances of corruption, and given that they're unlawful, they are therefore countable insofar as they're detective or there's complaint data and so on and so forth. So there's clearly a whole lot of measurable indices available. One thing I would stress here, though, is we do need to look at different institutions to determine what counts as corruption. Because, I mean, in the universities, there's not much corruption going on because there's not much embezzlement and there's not much bribery and so on. Yeah, well, let's forget that and look at plagiarism and look at the extent to which academics are stealing one another's ideas and so on. So, and that may be, as I think the earlier speaker, the point made, that may be greatly enhanced, as it were, by new technology. I mean, GPT is a case in point. So we need to be contextually sensitive, both in terms of the nature of the particular institution, which changes over time and so on, but also we need to be thinking about what in that institution at that time is likely to be undermining things, and that therefore, and this again resonates with Liz's point, that and you may need to sort of figure out there are new and different forms of corruption, and maybe you need to have regulations and laws in relation to those and so on and so forth. The other thing, of course, you can help yourself to in terms of measurable is sort of proxy indicators, which I mean, the standard kind of examples. There's a lot of ghost employees that suggests corruption. Proxy indicators aren't corruption per se, but they're proxies for corruption, and some of those are measurable in certain contexts. Okay, so it's quite consistent with the notion of institutional corruption that I've outlined, that there are a whole lot of things that are measurable. The first thing, of course, is to define, as again pointed out by Liz, but we've got to define, and indeed this could involve a certain amount of research and then count the kinds of action that typically constitute corruption, and there's the usual list, and you can count perpetrators. What's particularly useful in terms of measurements and is highly practical is where the relevant data is actually recorded, and this, if there are legal cases, but not necessarily just legal cases, because there's a whole lot of data that organisations have, complaints data, they've got data about, even if they're not making it available, professional associations have data, and a lot of this stuff is countable, as are the perpetrators. There are tricky issues in relation to this, of course, because when you have an offence, there are different ways of counting it. It could be one offence, but if it involves 5 people, there may be multiple different legal offences in the one instance and so on. So you've got to be very careful handling the quantitative data. What you're counting is, and of course, when in one jurisdiction, say if you take one jurisdiction and they say these are the number of thefts or something, in another jurisdiction it says that it's much less. Well, it depends how they're counting it actually, and it may be that if they count it in the same way, the reverse is the case. Okay, so you've got official record. You've got, of course, complaints data, investigations, substantiated, for example, convictions, and so on and so on and so forth. There's all these perception indices, of course, that are used by Transparency International and so on and so forth. They're obviously very problematic in a whole lot of different ways, but on the other hand, they can be part of the mix, and if you've got very experienced experts who are very familiar with what's going on and have done a lot of case studies and so on and so forth, their judgments may be extremely valuable. And if a whole lot of them say the same thing, particularly if it's sort of more general claims about the extent of corruption as opposed to strictly quantifiable, then that can be fed into the mix as well. Another point that can be made is with certain corrupt actions, the constitutive element of the action is actually countable. So if you take money laundering and bribes, I mean, you can say, well, we can count the size of the bribe, and therefore we can count the total of the 100 bribes we've identified, or we can count the amount of money we know that's been laundered. And we can add that up and so on and so forth. So there are plenty of things that can be counted, but there is, of course, a difference between all the things that in theory could be counted, but we don't, since all this stuff's happening in secrecy and so on, there's a bit of a problem with enforcement. And so there's oddly enough, the organized crime, the criminals and other corrupt people don't necessarily allow you in to do the counting, they're trying to hide it all from you. But if we take some other examples of the complexity of the extent of corruption, I mean, if we take the well-known, we need to make some distinctions. So we've got the act, which is, say, bribery, misappropriation of funds and so on, which has a tendency to cause some institutional effects, undermine institutional purposes. So you've got the act of bribery, it undermines certain institutional purposes. That's the second thing. But the third thing is that there are also the external effects of corruption. So the corruption itself consists of the act of bribery, and it's corruption because it has a tendency to have certain impact on the institution. But then there's the further question as to the indirect effects on the external to the institution as a result of this institutional corruption. So if we just to work through an example, the well-known resources curse, revenue from natural resources misappropriated by ostensibly democratic government, siphoned off. So there's a bunch of bribery, there's misappropriation, and so on and so forth. That's your corrupt actions in the first instance. That undermines, amongst other things, democratic institutions because it facilitates and enables authoritarianism, as often the case. And then there's a further question as the impact of undermining democratic institutions. For example, it may impoverish the general population. So there's at least three dimensions, and we need to get clear on what it is we're measuring. Are we measuring the number of bribes and so on? Are we measuring the impact of those bribes in that context on the institution? Or are we trying to measure the entirely indirect impact on the wider society, and these are three different things, and of course they're. I was talking about the resource curse, but that threefold distinction in relation to government, I think, can be usefully worked through in relation to Trump, who's clearly engaged in a whole lot of corrupt actions that are clearly undermining a whole lot of institutions, including government. And further down the track will almost certainly impoverish certain sections of the population, notably as a consequence of his latest, whatever he called, was it the great lovely bill or whatever it is that he's put through. But inevitably, I think there's quantification's useful, but in the end, it can't do the whole job that we need to do to make judgments about the extent of corruption in particular contexts and particular institutions. But there's still a lot of work that can be done. And it's very, very useful. You don't want to be addicted to it, I guess, is the point. Okay, another point that needs to be made here, I think, is we need to distinguish between counting corruption and grading corrupt actions. So it's bribery, okay, or it's money laundering, or it's, okay, fine, there's instance of. But then we need to ask ourselves about the level of seriousness of this particular crime type or of this instance of a given crime type. So if we're going to quantify, a famous, well, not famous, but an instance that came to me. I was interviewing a whole lot of police many years ago in the drug area, and they had to get up the number of arrests of drug dealers. And so what they did at the end of the month is they went out there and they basically arrested a whole lot of low-level drug dealers because the numbers were high. But of course, they hadn't made much impact on the actual serious people at the high end of it, because that's a hell of a lot more difficult. So the point is that we need to be able to grade particular acts of corruption as to their seriousness. And in grading them, sometimes it's just due to the nature of the act. I mean, perjury is problematic, undermining criminal trials and so on. But sometimes it's to do with the effects. Some acts in certain contexts have much more profound effects than other ones. The LIBOR manipulation doesn't sound like much. It was these people in the banking industry just sort of fiddling with the the financial benchmarks, it was a clear case of corruption. But when you realize that the LIBOR rate is the interest rate that trillions of dollars of bank loans, mortgages, and so on are based on, you get an idea of the seriousness of the adverse impact. So we need to distinguish between the act itself and how it might be inherently problematic in a certain context. We need to think about what its effects would be if we're talking about the seriousness of that particular act because we've got to grade it. We can't just count things. We've got to grade things with relation to the seriousness. I mean, if you think about this, one of the ways in terms of if you take the drug case or if you take some of the bribery cases, one of the ways of grading, say, well, and this is a proxy indicator, you say, well, this has been, because the seriousness has been thought about by the politicians and the police and so on and so forth, they say this is very serious. Why? Well, how do we quantify it? Well, it attracts a minimum jail term of 5 years. That makes it serious. And so counting those instances of offences that attract that kind of jail sentence by definition makes them serious. But that's a proxy indicator, right? That's a proxy indicator, but nevertheless a potentially very, very useful one. Okay, so I think I'm probably babbled on for longer than my allotted time here. But so in conclusion, we need to distinguish the act of corruption, the internal effects, which is to say it's corruption of the institution, and the external effects, which is the effect of the corruption on the general population or whatever it happens to be. And we need to make sure which of these three things we're actually measuring. And secondly, we need to quantify graded actions and effects, because it's not just how many acts of bribery, it's how many acts of serious bribery. It's not simply how many offences in a given area, and of course there remains the problem of identifying actions that aren't necessarily breaches of regulation or aren't necessarily unlawful and so on and so forth. Okay, sorry, the final point is we can actually marry some of these quantifiable measures with other considerations. We can certainly use, say, proxy indicators as well as quantification of constitutive elements. So, for example, if you take money laundering, we can look at the quantum of money laundered, but we can also look at things like the shell companies. If there's a huge number of shell companies, then that to get a better picture of the extent of corruption in some area. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Professor Miller. My takeaway from this part of your presentation is I do see a glimpse of hope. And I really got the impression that potentially a way to reflect all the point that you made is a bottom-up approach, and it reminded me, so bottom-up or context-based approach that looks not just about how to measure corruption in general, but specifically looking at the specific organization and institution that we want to assess. And it reminded me a recent book that is available online from Mark Pyman and Paul Haywood about sector-based approaches to fighting corruption, where they make the point about how forms of corruption vary between the sectors, and even forms of corruption that would look the same at first, they really have, or they operate in different ways depending on the sector. And so at least my takeaway of this part of your presentation is we have certain resources. The question is, how do we tie them specifically to the health of the institution? Professor Ceva, so when considering your discussion about accountability deficits, which as I mentioned before, I find it fascinating. I also do wonder how it overlaps with broader concerns about public integrity, which of course the discussion about public integrity and corruption as being two sides of the same coin it has a long pedigree. if not completely clarifies if that is indeed the case, but the conversation continues being relating the two aspects, right? I wonder, how do you see your approach influencing the operationalization of corruption and the way we measure it, or even how you would like to see your approach influencing the area of measurement?
Yes, so I'll just try to offer two points for further conversation, as we understand we're already 2 minutes over time. So the first point concerns actually measurement, and as you suggest, the margins for thinking how the view of corruption as a deficit of office accountability could actually be operationalized to reflect about measurement indicators. So I really appreciate the distinction Leeds made between the two questions, where measurement concerns the how much of something issue, whereas definitions concern that what is something issues. I appreciate the distinction between the two, and I wonder how one influences the other in a circular process. What seems to me interesting is, and that perhaps an optimistic note, not so much for the measurement, but for the research about measurement, try to reflectively think about the account of what is something inform the measurement of how much of something, to the extent that to measure something, we need to have a clear understanding of what something is, but how, going backwards, what comes up from this inquiry, this empirical inquiry, this measurement inquiry, can then flow back into the definitions and accounts of corruption. So I see the circular process as interesting. And in fact, I see the circular process as a process instantiating accountability in itself, because it instantiates a measure of responsiveness of indicators to concepts and concepts to indicators. So that's the first line of methodological reflections that I would like to draw. Knowing that being a philosopher is, I'm a bit uncomfortable with offering suggestions on how to operationalize concepts, but I'm very much interested in thinking in ways how also these more ethically characterized definition of corruption as a deficit of office accountability could be translated into indicators. For instance, looking at concrete accountability practices and how much of those practices can actually be positively or negatively correlated with institutional dysfunction such as corruption. I have an ongoing conversation with the research group led by Alice Mattoni at the University of Bologna, and we're actually exploring the possibility of giving a more concrete grasp on this accountability view of corruption. So any suggestion, any input in that sense, to me, would be extremely interesting and relevant. The second brief suggestion or item of food for thought I would like to offer concerns how much weight actually to give to measurement issues in developing anti-corruption mechanisms. So there's been a tendency to conceive anti-corruption mechanisms as a result of quantitative measurements of corruption and using quantitative corruption indicators to lead anti-corruption action. So what my research offers is a complement to this approach, which looks less at ex post facto remedies to corruption. So we see corruption and we ask how we react to it, by complementing this with an ex ante facto approach to corruption, which is exactly the point of seeing corruption as a problem of public ethics and anti-corruption as a matter of developing an ethics of office that can guide the action of office holders so as to help them to avoid engaging in corruption in the first place. And that's where, if you wish, my view of corruption crosses path with the public integrity debate you were referring earlier on, and also the Republican virtue theory, which is not exactly my philosophical reference point, but it's certainly there's some significant overlap in terms of pinpointing the importance of an ethics approach to the use of power. And that's where I think that an important lesson to draw from this conversation is to think critically also about the anti-corruption instruments on which we've been relying so far, and how much they've been unilaterally, if you wish, derived from measurement indicators, and think how, again, they can be put in dialogue with more ex-ante ethical approaches. I gave the example of code of conduct earlier on, but also the ethical training of office holders is fundamental here. Ethical leadership programs that can train people occupying institutional roles throughout hierarchies, not necessarily top leaders, in order to make a more responsible use of their power of office, so as to making them more capable in accounting critically for what they do. Because ultimately, institutional action is very indeterminate. The use of public power is imbued with indeterminacy and discretion. And the only way to exercise this discretion responsibly is by responsibilizing, mobilizing actively those occupy institutional roles, always to ask themselves the question before acting, what am I doing now? What is the point of what I'm doing? What I'm doing, is it supportive of institutional action? Is it curtailing it? Is this demanding? Yes, but holding a public office, let's face it, is a very demanding responsibility. Therefore, if we hold this office, we must be ready to take on this kind of responsibility that can be also scholarly attuned, because of course there are different responsibilities across hierarchies. You can't really expect leaders to bear the same amount of responsibility as people down the line, but the kind of responsibility would be the same, although the degree of responsibility can be attuned also to roles. So these are just sort of points to think about. No recipe, of course, but a general approach to a more responsive and accountable use of power of office, alongside measurement issues, as working in tandem to put together, to mobilize all possible instruments we have to counteract corruption.
Thank you. Those thoughts are very inspiring, and I think that they are very timely as well, because it reminds us of why we engage in this sort of conversation. Too often discussions or efforts to measure corruption may feel a little self-serving, if that makes sense, in terms of, in the exercise, as I mentioned in the past, the process of measuring something is an exercise of power, because we define the phenomenon that we consider to be a problem. We kind of sterilize it. We produce a number that hides a lot of the nuance behind, and then we use it to label and rank things, organizations, countries, people, right? But that technical aspect ends up being very detached to the political realities and even the consequences of the output of that measurement effort. And so I really enjoy the last part about, this point of responsibility, and not just responsibility of office holders, but even from our side, the academic side, the responsibility of really understanding the effects or the nuance, the biases, the implications, the exercise of power that we are connected to when having these type of discussions, and eventually when working new designs of how to measure corruption. Thank you so much, Professor Ceva. And of course, I want to express my deep gratitude to all the presenters today, Professor David-Barrett, Dr. Dobson Phillips, Professor Miller, and again, Professor Ceva, for not just having donated this amount of time, almost 2 hours here with us, but also for bringing this very insightful work and having this willingness to connect it to something that perhaps when you were writing about new understanding of corruption, you weren't really thinking about measurement, But again, I feel that this is something that anybody connected to the work of how to quantify corruption can benefit from. So I'm extremely grateful about this. Thank you very much again for a very insightful presentation and discussion. And thank you everyone for taking the time to be with us today. And I look forward to seeing you all virtually, if not in person, very, very soon.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.
Yes, thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks for organising it, Joseph.
Not at all. Have a
Thank
lovely
you.
morning, afternoon, all of you. Take good care.